Okay, we're continuing with Minchas Chinuch in the midst of Kiddush, which is a Torah obligation. And he explained that in the name of the Shai that although there is a nusach, there's the text of Kiddush, which we say the bracha, excuse me, 1 second. No. So he explained that, for instance, we have a certain text for Birchas HaMazon. The first three blessings of Birchas HaMazon, they're a deraisa, it's Torah obligation. You eat, you say it, you must acknowledge God. If one makes up his own acknowledgement in his own words and does not say it within the context of three blessings, one does not even fulfill the Torah obligation. Although the text was authored by Moshe Rabbeinu, by Yeshua ben Nun, or by the men of the High Assembly, unless you say it as they prescribed should be said, one doesn't even fulfill the Torah obligation, because they were endowed with the ability, with the power, that they were able to negate the value of what you do unless you do it as they prescribe it should be done. So he's saying the same thing with Kiddush. If you don't say Kiddush on a Torah level, one does not have to say Kiddush necessarily on a cup of wine. But since the rabbi said, Kachir al hayayin, you must say it in a cup of wine. If you don't say it in a cup of wine, even if you say Vayechulu, which is the psukim, the verses for Kiddush, one does not fulfill his Torah obligation. It has to be done the way the rabbi said it should be done. That's what he's saying over here. We're on the page, the second page, Shinun Hey, Vayinshim Kos Gabkein, the Kiddush Lo al Kos. If you say Kiddush not on a cup of wine, Vod Nafkamino, Veves Dvorv Kama Pomi, Bechiburi, he says he cites the Shagasari many times during this work. Vein Kam Mokum Laharich, Ein Shabo Zayin. Vayin Tosasota Lamed Beis, or Menalef Dirvaso, Kriyashmu Tvilo. Kriyashman Tvilo. Chosvu, the Kiddush Nemar B'choloshim. Kiddush can be said in any language. We want to say Kiddush in English, French, whatever language may be. Afilo inam mevin haloshon. Even if you don't understand the language, as long as the language you use is the language which is an accurate translation of the Hebrew, one fulfills the obligation. Not everybody agrees with what Tosa says. The way it's cited in Halacha, that if it's Hebrew, even if you don't understand Hebrew, you would say, why? Because Hebrew, the language is innately, the words mean what they mean. Any other language, the only way you could fulfill your obligation, you have to understand the language. If you don't understand the language, one does not fulfill this obligation. Tosa's position is no, just as one fulfills his obligation when you say it in Hebrew, although you don't understand Hebrew, the same thing is true regarding any language. He's citing this Tosas in Sota. Rambam of Rav Mechaber, Emivin Zeb B'Kiddush Hayom. However, regarding Kiddush, they don't say that's the case. I'm Ogen Avram Sim Samach Beis and Kot Now finds Kuf Tzadi Gimel Tzidkom Beis Udvar Meilul Inyan Beis Eloshim B'Fuzar B'Makomus Rabim. This law that you say things in multiple languages are applicable in many instances in halacha. V'tzar chibu miyuchad lefalpel b'chol mitzvah la'atuyi b'dibur. And he says you can have a separate work to discuss in depth all the mitzvahs that have to do with you fulfill the mitzvahs of verbal expression. Is there a difference if you say it yourself in the other language or you hear it from a third party? Then kamakoma. This is not the location. Again, to discuss it. Hine dasa Rambam kan halacha aleph. The Rambam regarding the halacha of Kiddush in halacha aleph, ubalocha of Varav Hamechaber kan and the Chinuch. Vabi Rishon the Kiddush Yom hu dvar Torah b'dvarim. That on a Torah level you fulfill your obligation of Kiddush just with words. Aval al yayin or al pas hu rak b'divrei sofrim. But to say the Kiddush on a cup of wine or on bread, like Friday night, that's purely rabbinical. On a Torah level, you don't have to say Kiddush on a cup of wine. Tos perak abi psochim kovovim and olive tivat tzochreu, but it says Tosis and psochim sefuki misafklu. They haven't resolved it. It's question whether it's a Torah law or it's rabbinic law. The efsher hu minat Torah lekadish al kos yayin. Maybe there is an obligation to say the kiddush on a cup of wine. I mentioned the other day, Tosis Nozer says this. Hatimo hi rak midrabanim. You have to say the kiddush on a cup of wine. The drinking of the cup, that's rabbinical. But there is a position that says that the kiddush must be said on a cup of wine. Ayin nozi daf dalet of aleph, which I mentioned the other day. Gabi yazir yayin mitzvah. My new. It says if a person initially says he becomes a Nazarite, can't drink wine. He's not permitted to drink the wine of mitzvah. What's wine of mitzvah? So the Gemara explains that's the wine of the kiddush and the wine of Havdalah. That's the wine of a mitzvah. On that, the Gemara says mushba b'harsinayu. But how could the Nazirus, how could the Nazarite take effect? The Torah says he must drink the cup of wine. Einshom Forish Daito, Gabi the Kiddush ala kosu minute. So Gemara answers no. That the Torah laws, you must say the Kiddush on the cup of wine. But the drinking of the wine, that's rabbinical. As a result of that, even though you have an obligation to say Kiddush on a cup of wine, since the obligation to drink is only rabbinical, accepting Nazaritehood overrides the rabbinic law, and therefore one doesn't drink the Kiddush. Latosis lo kosu kain, advar matikim, ein or chaim, hilchos Kiddush, simerei shayin alpit taz, sivkot yutes umogravrom, shuvas shagas aryeh, hilchos Shabbos, simin samach chichril gamkik today azu. They conclude according to the position dal kos egem drabanan. That you must say Kiddush on a cup of wine. Not only is the drinking rabbinical, even saying the Kiddush on a cup of wine is rabbinical. He says many speak lengthily about this, therefore he's not going to speak more about it. Okay. Gemara explains in Psachim, Omer Avacher by Yaakov. Now this is very important. If you don't say Zech Litzis Mitzrayim Kiddush, one does not fulfill the obligation on Torah level. You must mention a Kiddush, Zech Litzis Mitzrayim. As we say, when Hashem says, how does God identify? I took you out of Egypt. Kiddush, it says also, you were in Egypt. You were in Egypt. It says, you must remember the day that you left Egypt. Ten Commandments says, remember Shabbos and sanctify it. So it says Zocher regarding Shabbos, and it says Zocher in regard to Kiddush. And nobody argues. Everybody agrees that Kiddush you must insert and mention Tzis Mitzrayim. It's a Torah law. Below Hiski Tzis Mitzrayim lo yotze klal. And if a person does not mention Tzis Mitzrayim Kiddush, one does not fulfill his obligation of Kiddush. It's learned from two words. It's a Zocher regarding Shabbos, and it's a Zocher regarding Tzis Mitzrayim. Ugzera Shava Havik Gufi Torah. Ugzera Shava, pairing two words are the same. That's a Torah. That's a Torah interpretation. Afili Onesh Kavur B'Shas Kamagufi Torah Nubik Zereshava. The Rifa Rosh Heviu Member Zusham, and the Rifa Rosh they cite the statement of Ravacha in Halacha that you have to mention Tzis Mitzrayim. The Rambam kan enu mevi members of Mefurish. Hear this? The Rambam doesn't say when you say Kiddush, you have to mention Tzis Mitzrayim. It's a good point. So in the footnote here, he says something interesting. The Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos does mention it, although in the Yad Chazaka, which is the magnum opus of the Rambam, he doesn't mention, but in the Sefer HaMitzvos he says that you must mention Yitzis Mitzrayim. But he says in the Frankel edition, he takes it out. It's not there. Excuse me. Somebody rings the bell. I have to take this 1 second. Not a problem.
No. She wants to do whole basement.
Okay.
Do you see the? Which wood?
No, I'm busy. Sorry.
We've been recording, Rabbi, just so you know.
Yeah, I just want to repeat what I just said. That he says the Rambam does not mention it in the Yad Chazokah. When it says Kiddush, he doesn't mention you have to say Yitzis Mitzrayim. He says the Rif and the Rosh does say. So he brings on the bottom, cites on the bottom that the Rambam is Sefer HaMitzvos, where he enumerates the mitzvahs, the positive commandment of Kiddush. He says there you must mention Yitzis Mitzrayim. There's an edition of the Rambam called the Frankel Rambam, which was done with manuscripts and everything. And he says in the original manuscript of Rambam of the Sefer Mitzvahs, it's not there. And therefore he deletes it, even Sefer HaMitzvahs, because otherwise there's a contradiction. In the Yad Chazokah, he doesn't mention it. And the Sefer Mitzvahs does mention it. Therefore he deletes it from there. That's what he brings on the bottom. Okay, continue recording.
You'll have some editing to do, Rabbi.
Varif varosh heviu memrsu shom varambam kanei memei memrsu fush ach somach atzmo. B'mashe maybe kan halacha beis nusach kiddush umuska shom tzis mitzrayim. He says although he doesn't mention it, but when he records the text of the kiddush, he does mention Yitzis Mitzrayim. Although he doesn't say that if it's omitted, you're not yotzei. But Rav Mechabetz Archi and they know maybe din ze'adin. He says, but the chinuch, when he brings the mitzvah, he doesn't mention you have to mention Yitzis Mitzrayim. Ze'poshet be'ezen nusach shom im mal hayom mal tzorach lahaski Yitzis Mitzrayim. Gichena mitzvah min Torah. That's the Torah mitzvah. So why does the chinuch mention that you have to mention Yitzis Mitzrayim? Val pizeh ni toma mod al achronim. And therefore, he's taken aback the Achron, the later authorities, the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, Ein Mogen Avram, Simrei Shayin Alv, Sukkot Alv, Shekosev, the Tefillah Shabbos, Yotzi De Kiddush. There's a question Friday night we say Vaychul and Shmon Esrei, and the Mogen Avram says when you say Vaychul, one fulfills his obligation of Kiddush. So therefore, when you say it on the cup of wine, it's only rabbinical because you already fulfilled it in the Shmon Esrei. The problem is when we say Vaychul and Shmon Esrei, there's no mention of Yitzis Mitzrayim. So if there's no mention, how does one fulfill his Torah obligation in the Shmon Esrei? Ki ala yain hu rak midivrei sofrim, ein shem dagam rvovo mefalpelin in noshim motzias anoshim or afil lehepich im rak ish yispal arbis they no chayv elu drabonon. Now there's a question. There's this concept known as arevus. If I say Kiddush and I have mind to cover those listening, I could cover them. There's a question, if a woman says Kiddush, could she be yotze someone of herself? Because that I'm able to cover you and you're able to cover me, because we're all responsible for one another. But the question is, if the woman was never, ever put in the position that she's responsible for anybody but herself, if that's the case, if she says the Kiddush, she can't cover someone else, right? Because she's not responsible. So he said, and it's not simple. Or the other way, even the man who's responsible, the responsibility is to cover men, but he can't cover a woman. That's the notable this position. Okay? So it's interesting. There's no mention. They say if you say Kiddush, when it comes to the Kiddush at the meal Friday night, it's all rabbinical because you already fulfilled it during Shmon Esrei. But in Shmon Esrei, you look at the text, there's no mention of Yitzis Mitzrayim. Rako isha mispal arba she'enu chayvel midrabonon arvus nasa rosh brochas pei gimel oshu gimel. The noshim enem chal arevus. The Rosh's position in brochas is that a woman is not bound by the laws of being responsible for someone else. Ein Sham Gambling, you caught Ben you Gimoshono. Ein Betas, if caught you test, Bemase, Shekidish al Mayim, Shekosev, the Yotzi, the Mitzvah bin Torah, Bamir Luchot B'liyai. Hear this. He brings the Taz, the person mistakenly, he took a glass, a cup, it had water rather than wine, and he said Kiddush on the cup of water. So he's not he didn't say Kiddush on a wine. And water doesn't qualify even as Chamar Medina. So he says, he brings from the Taz says, your Torah obligation you fulfilled, because he said Kiddush, although the rabbinic obligation you did not fulfill, because you have to say it in a cup of wine, but the Torah obligation you did fulfill. Even though it wasn't simple, we said before that if you don't fulfill the mitzvah as prescribed by the Chachamim, they nullify the mitzvah. They say you're not Yotzei. One does not, it's not Yotzei. Toma al Sham b'sefer Dagum Revava. So the Dagum Revava is taken back. The Choved Doraisa Kfar Yotzei B'Tfilah, right? He says, when you said the Kiddush on the cup of wine, although you Yotzei the Doraisa, he says, what do you mean Yotzei Doraisa? He already said Shmon, he said Ma'ariv. He already was Yotzei Doraisa without any cup, period. So why does he say only in the situation where he said on a cup of water? Chem Sefer Pri Begodim, Cholachronim Kulam, Ochzu Shar, the Yotzei B'Tfilah Shabbos Yad Kiddush Hayom Min HaTorah. They all say that you Yotzei the Kiddush of the day. You see, Yom means not the daytime, but the Kiddush of the day with the Vayichudu in the Shmon Esrei. Losam HaPoskim, the Kiddush Al Yain Hu Rak Rabbanon, Ein Divrayim, Ul Didi Tamur Ma'od. Kevin Nusach Tfilah Shel Shabbos Einon Maskim Tzis Mitzrayim. Since in the text of Ma'ariv, when we say Vayichudu, there's no mention of Tzis Mitzrayim. Vadai Enu Yotzei Min HaTorah Klaus, how he Yotzei. We said that it's based on Gzera Shava, that you have to mention Tzis Mitzrayim as what? As part of Kiddush. Umemra B'Fureshisi B'Licholek the Nilbek Gzera Shava, and nobody argues this in the Gemara. Okay, Vadim Lo Hiski B'Kiddush Eza Nusach Shomer L'Kovet Hayom Tzis Mitzrayim. So if you say Kiddush and you don't mention Tzis Mitzrayim, nobody would hold. And the Yotzei Min HaTorah Klal, one does not fulfill his Torah obligation. Therefore, as a result of that, regardless of what you have in mind when you say Vayichulu, you have in mind you want to be Yotzei, the Torah obligation, you're not Yotzei. One does not fulfill the obligation, because since there's no mention of Tzis Mitzrayim, one does not fulfill his Torah obligation. So all the discussion, the halachic discussions, are all immediately negated. They're talking, because Yotzei, you can't cover the woman, this and that. It's not relevant. But the Taz is speaking very good. He took a glass of water, he thought it was wine, and he said Kiddush on a glass of water. So what nusach did he say? He said the nusach of Kiddush. So that the Taz says, although he wasn't Yotzei the rabbinic law, that he says should say in a cup of wine, but the Doraisa was Yotzei, because what was the text that he said on that cup of water? The text was Kiddush, and the text of Kiddush Friday night, we do mention Yitzis Mitzrayim. Avo b'tfilah shel Shabbos, v'adeina Yotzei klal, but the Veichulu we say in Shmon Esrei Friday night, you do not fulfill your obligation. They ain't shom zech Yitzis Mitzrayim, because there's no mention of Yitzis Mitzrayim. Ach, b'yom t'shchalius b'Shabbos. He says, what about if you have Shabbos, Yom Tov falling out on Shabbos? So we say a different Shmon Esrei, right? There we do mention Shmon Esrei Yitzis Mitzrayim. Okay? Yotzei Min HaTorah, there you Yotzei on the Torah level. But throughout the year we only say Vayichulu, and there's no mention of Yom Tov. Nearly Borur Dein Yotzei B'Tfilah. Without a question, you definitely did not fulfill your obligation of Kiddush with the Shmon Esrei, because there's no mention in Tzis Mitzrayim. Imkain lo yotza af min Torah. So one does not fulfill his obligation, even on a Torah level. Okay, there's a Ber Alocha in Hilchas Kiddush. He cites the Minchas Chinuch, and he brings, I think, a Shibbolei Aleket, which is a Rishon, that in his nusach of the Vayichulu in Shmon Esrei, and that nusach, it had Zechet Tzis Mitzrayim in the Shmon Esrei, even Friday night. That's the only way the Chofetz Chaim, the Be'er Halacha, is able to address and answer the Minchas Chinuch's question. Otherwise, he says, he agrees, he accepts it. Without Yitzis Mitzrayim, one does not fulfill his obligation. So over here at the bottom, it's a commentary at the bottom of Minchas Chinuch. He says something interesting. So he cites over here a number of possibilities to answer this. He says the Minchas Chinuch said seems to be it's learned from the Gzeir Shava. A Gzeir Shava is Doraisa. Now, what is a Gzeir Shava Doraisa? If you have two words and you match them up, those words were given at Sinai to match up. Let's say we match up two words. Is that a Gzeir Shava? It's not a Gzeir Shava. It's only the words that were meant to match up on which the Torah given at Sinai. It means what's stated by A is stated by B. But he says many Achronim learned, the later authorities, that the Gzeir Shava is an asmachta. The Torah never gave these two words to match up. If that's the case, the whole limud, what we're basing upon, is rabbinical. As a result of that, if one omitted it, one is Yotzi with Vayichulu. Because the Gzeir Shava, it's not a bona fide Gzeir Shava. That's the way some Achronim explain it. And then he says on the bottom, although the Minchas Chinuch is asking it, he says he found the Tosas Rid, which is one of the Bali Tosas, asked this question. Avol Shabbos v'Kiddush al Kos anu omrim zech tzitz Mitzrayim v'Kiddush tefillah and anu omrim osa v'kasha. He asked the question, Loma lo niska me'omer b'Shabbos v'Tefillah shu ikra Kiddush min haTorah. He says the Tosas Rid asks. There's a Rishon asking the question. If we say ve'chulu in Shmon Esrei, because it's the equivalent of Kiddush, so when they legislated, you say have it part of Shemon Esrei, why don't they have an additional insert? That's the Tosaf's question. So he's asking why in Yom Tov do we say Zech L'Tzis Mitzrayim and on Shabbos not? Yeah, this is what the Be'er Halacha brings. It says the some Rishonim say that the Girsa, the text of Shmon Esrei Friday night, it's inserted there. Zech Tzitz Mitzrayim, Kain Osi Shapish Yotze the Kiddush Chovas Kiddush B'Tfilah. As a result of that, according to that text, that it was, the questions are not questions. 1 second. He asked the question. Shekos of the Yoshik B'Tfilah, in Minuschosh Levana Ein Tzitz Mitzrayim Tzkers B'Tfilah, Urei B'Dvar Shmuel Psochim Daf Divrei Masut Tzorch She'evi Me'agon Rav Moshe Feinstein. He cites Rav Moshe She'bidl Chachomim Nusach Zer Kedei Shlo Yetzei. Initially, Yitzis Mitzrayim was part of the net Nusach in Shemon Esrei. They took it out because they wanted people to be Yotze on the cup of wine, a Doraisa. Hear this? Initially, the way it was legislated, Yitzis Mitzrayim was part of a Yechulu. So therefore, they were Yotze. So therefore, the Kiddush on the cup is rabbinical. But since the optimum way to be say the Kiddush Doraisa is on a cup of wine, therefore, they took it out of Vayechulu. So now when you say Kiddush on the cup, it's going to be a Doraisa. The Yikayim Ikar HaKiddush Al Torah B'Mokum Suda. B'Sichlon Sofrim. And also, if he already was Yotze, how could he cover his wife? Now he says on the bottom, "Ikar akushi yesh mechrom shenoktu, shemeduktek loshen Rav Yaakov says, tzorech, you have to mention tzorech lahaski tzis Mitzrayim." He says the connotation tzorech mashma rakdin lechatchila. You must. He doesn't say chayov. If it will be an obligation, it should say chayiv. What's tzorech? You should. So the connotation should means it's the right thing to do. But if you omit it, yotze. But David yotzo afim lo hiskitzis Mitzrayim. V'odi shloma shegera askorzu himidine hitzis Mitzrayim. Ve'enu makevs p'kim mitzvahs kiddush. Two separate things. There's a mitzvah to say hitzis in kiddush, but it doesn't mean you're not yotze kiddush. Hear this. I'll give you an example. If a person forgets to say Ya'alav Yavo Rosh Chodesh Mincha, so you have to, the way we ruled, you have to say Shmoneh Esrei twice at Ma'ariv, right? Rosh Chodesh ends Mincha. Person forgot to dav Mincha, forgot to say Ya'alav Yavo in Mincha. Okay? Does he have to say two Ma'arivs? If you say you're not Yotzei, Shmoneh Esrei without Ya'alav Yavo is not a Shmoneh Esrei. Although the Shmoneh Esrei is going to say after Yom Chodesh is going to be identically as the Shmoneh Esrei said, right? He's not going to have the insert of Ya'alav Yavo after Rosh Chodesh. So then you're required to say another Shmoneh Esrei, because the Shmoneh Esrei without Ya'alav Yavo, what is it? It's not a Shmoneh Esrei. Well, no. The other Pidyotosis is you have an obligation to say Ya'alav Yavo on Rosh Chodesh 3 times, each one of the Shmoneh Esreis. You can only say to have that insert in Shmoneh Esrei. So the Shmoneh Esrei is valid even if you omit it. So why do you have to repeat Shmoneh Esrei? Not because the Shmoneh Esrei wasn't valid, but because you have an obligation to say Ya'alav Yavo and Mincha, and the only location you could say it is within Shmoneh Esrei. Okay, so that's the discussion, whether you have to repeat it, whether you have to say 2 Ma'arivs, Shmoneh Esrei by Ma'ariv or not. Was the Shmoneh Esrei valid or wasn't valid? If it's valid, it's only to be able to say Ya'alav Yavo, said Shmoneh is valid. There's no reason to say another Shmoneh Esrei. So some want to say it's the same thing. There's a mitzvah kiddush. Yitzis Mitzrayim has to be said Friday night, but where do you say it? You say it within kiddush. So the kiddush is valid kiddush. It's valid. So why do you have to repeat kiddush again? To be able to say Yitzis Mitzrayim. If that's the case, when you repeat kiddush again, what is that kiddush? It's rabbinical. It's like mentioning Ya'alav Yavo within Shmoneh Esrei. Okay? El Shem Lo Hiski Tzis Mitzrayim Lo Kaim Mitzvah Sechir Tzis Mitzrayim Karoi O Mikol Mokom Yotzei Choves Kiddush B'Doraisa. Interesting approach. Listen to this one. When we right before we say Shmoneh Esrei, what do we say? We mentioned V'emuna kol zos. We mentioned Tzis Mitzrayim, right? V'emuna kol zos, right? We took out Mitzrayim, Hashem, whatever it is. We speak about Egypt, leaving Egypt. So because that's juxtaposed to the Shmoneh Esrei, that's like you mentioned Yitzis Mitzrayim in Vayechulu. Even though it's not in Shmoneh Esrei proper, but since it's juxtaposed, that's the equivalent of that. The Summer Gudel Tefillah, Kilu Hiski Yitzis Mitzrayim B'Tefillah V'Yotzei Chovas Kiddush Shmei Torah. Right? What do we say right before Shmoneh Esrei? Shomrim Be'Yisrael Shabbos is a Shabbos. Shomrim Achash Givenu Shu Somach Laskor Yitzis Mitzrayim. Then he brings others. Yeshe Kosush Chivs Mitzrayim who rak B'Kiddush Pesach. Yeah, at the Seder, where Rav Acha B'Yaakov says you have to say Yitzis, that's the Kiddush at the Seder. Av B'Kiddush Shabbos Yitzorach Laskor Yitzis Mitzrayim. That you don't have to. Don't mispalm Yom Tov, Maskir Shabbos Yitzis Mitzrayim Yeshe Kosav. Get it. It's good to Mitzrayim B'Kiddush who Miprote Malsa Shabbos. So over here in 35. Okay,